Welcome back. In this video I'm going to talk about how to analyze survey data, because surveys are everywhere and they are one of the main tools to really answer social science quantitative questions. Once we've gotten to grasp with that, we can then use real-world datasets to explore further statistical techniques, but also to look at some questions that at least I find very interesting. So what am I going to talk about in this video? Firstly, a bit about what kinds of surveys there are that we can access and that we can see in the world. Then about some difficulties with using surveys to measure complex constructs, such as social attitudes. And then I'm briefly going to talk about the need to weight data in surveys to correct for imbalances in the samples. There's a separate video about how to use weighted data in R. I highly encourage you to watch that, even though some of those techniques are beyond the scope of what will be assessed in this course, because they're fairly advanced. But to start with, surveys are obviously everywhere. Whenever you look at the news, there will be some survey claiming that something has been found about people's thoughts, about people's opinions. It's then worth looking a little bit deeper, because obviously a survey can be me asking 10 people on the street, or it can be a really rigorous, representative, international collaboration. So some surveys are great, many surveys are not so great, but still they're used a lot. Both for kind of publications, market research, but also for real scientific articles. So just a couple of examples here. The very interesting examples for us, I think, are the large national social surveys that are available for anyone to download, play with, and actually do research with. Some of them are run within a single country, like this British social attitude survey. Some are run across many countries, like the World Values Survey. And then both exist in many different countries with different focus. So ALBUS is a social attitude survey in Germany, the GSS is the American version of it, and then at the European level is the European Values Survey and the European Social Survey. And there are many, many more. All of these are freely available to researchers to test all kinds of different hypotheses with. So from the European Social Survey specifically, I just want to highlight a couple of different research questions that have been answered with their data. So one is this interesting comparative paper on electoral participation, trying to figure out why in some countries more people participate than in other countries. Many papers around immigration, some papers around life satisfaction, more immigration, and then attitudes towards other social and political issues. So all of these can be answered with reference to existing data sets. However, it's not easy to do good survey research for two main reasons. And the first reason is that sampling is just actually very hard when you try to study a whole national or even international population. I'd actually encourage you to rewatch the sampling video from week 3. But there's two key considerations in these large-scale surveys. The first one is, how do you actually get a sampling frame? A sampling frame is the list of people that could possibly be sampled. If I want to do a study with students at a specific university, getting the sampling frame is relatively easy. I just go to the registry, I ask them who are the students here. Then I have a list of everyone. On a national or even international level, it's much harder. You can take a phone book, clearly not everyone is in the phone book. You can take a voter register, not everyone is registered to vote. So depending on what sampling frame is used, you can immediately figure out that surveys might have a problem in accounting for the opinions of unregistered migrants, for example, undocumented migrants. So that's one question, what's the sampling frame? And the second question is, how do we actually deal with differential responses? Survey participation is always optional. Often people get paid so that more would participate. But still, even the best social surveys generally get about 30 to 40% response rates. probably that's not a random subset of the people they try to get to respond, but some groups will be more likely to participate than others. So that's also something to consider. To consider in designing your survey, how to get as many people as possible to respond, but then in analyzing your survey, to consider how to deal with the fact that some people have been more likely than others to participate. Effectively, all of the social surveys do cluster sampling, so they first look for a couple of locations to do the survey in, because most of them actually interview people face to face, and that's much easier if you do it in 100 municipalities rather than spread out over an entire country. So that's cluster sampling. And then the next step is to do some kind of stratified sampling. So to focus on sampling a specific number of, let's say, young people, middle-aged people, old people. That would be stratified sampling. Understanding the sampling approach, especially with regard to those two questions, is quite important when you try to figure out how to deal with a data set and when you try to figure out what kind of conclusions you might be able to trust from the data and where you have to be critical. So first difficulty, sampling. Second difficulty is, what do we actually ask people in a survey? Because most of the constructs we're interested in are very hard to measure. Asking people for their age is fine, but if I'm interested in something like sexism, racism, political orientation, then it becomes quite difficult to find questions that accurately measure that. Partly because participants might not have very stable views about any particular policy. So what can I really ask them about that taps into something that's stable for them? And then what do they have memory of? In a health area, for example, we're quite often interested in how much people exercise, how much people eat of certain kind of products. And just when you think about it yourself, honestly, would you be able to accurately respond how many units of alcohol you have drunk over the last year, for example? We generally don't have clear memory of that, most of us. So that's another thing to figure out, what kind of questions can we ask that people can really accurately respond to if they're motivated to. And then of course the third consideration is, are people actually willing to respond honestly? There are a couple of different levels to that. One is when you clearly ask people face to face, they might not be willing to tell you as an interviewer, but then there are also things around self-deception. Even if we are not afraid about what other people think, there's a clear tendency to remember and to want to believe that we engage in much healthier behaviors, for example, than we actually do. So there's a big question around how to ask questions in a way that get honest responses. We'll discuss examples for that in class, but I'd actually encourage you to think about it with regard to your own research field. I'm sure there is something sensitive in everyone's research, so what might be difficult questions to ask, and what might be ways to get to the answers. In practical terms, when we collect large data sets, we are somewhat constrained by the need to ask closed questions. Closed questions are questions that have very clearly defined possible answers. So they can be yes, no, they can be multiple choice, they can be on an ordered scale, and they can even be any numbers, as long as the scale for those numbers is very clear. So I might ask, do you like immigrants? Yes, no. I might ask, which immigrants do you like out of these 5 categories? I might ask, how far do you agree that immigrants should be here on a rating scale from entirely disagree to strongly agree? And I can ask, what's your best estimate for how many immigrants there are actually here? Right? So that would be examples for each of these categories. What's really difficult to do in a large-scale survey is to have a very open question where you say, well, what do you think about immigrants? Because, and for one, people usually don't know what to say, but also it's not easy to figure out what you could actually do with that data. It's really hard to analyze. So the overall challenge is how to ask good questions to explore complex constructs and how to use closed questions to do so, rather than open-ended, more qualitative questions. There are a couple of obvious issues to avoid, and we'll discuss examples in class, so I'll go through this quite quickly. One key issue to avoid is having multiple choice questions with missing choices. Not great if participants can't actually answer, can't give the answer that they would want to give. There are many issues around misunderstanding. So what do people understand by the question? What actually drives their answer? There's lots of research on the importance of framing and priming. So which way round do I ask a question? What's the question order? And how might that affect what people say? So for example, if I ask about specific aspects of your life satisfaction first, and then I ask you for an overall rating of your life satisfaction, those specific aspects start to determine the overall rating. So I ask you first, how often did you have time to hang out with your friends over the course of the past week? And then I ask you, how satisfied are you with your life? Suddenly, the free time with friends becomes one of the strongest predictors of life satisfaction. If I don't prime it that way, I ask the questions the other way around, the association will be much weaker. So that's something quite important to look at in a questionnaire. How are questions framed? How can earlier questions prime answers to later questions? Social desirability is again related to that honesty. So how can you ask questions in a way that don't give participants subtle information into what the expected, what the pleasant answer would be, and what can participants actually realistically self-report. If you, in line with what I said on the earlier slide, are able to think about one thing you might want to measure in your research, maybe think about these specific difficulties as well and how to avoid some of them. One thing that we always tend to do when we try to measure a complex construct is to create a scale rather than to just ask a single question. So the idea behind that is that you can't really ask someone, hey, how racist are you on a scale from 1 to 10? Because quite often it's clear what a socially desirable answer is, but also people just have no idea. So what we would tend to do is we would try to find a couple of different aspects that are all indicators for that construct, and then ask a couple of different things. The reason to do that is because we would say any specific measurement is any measurement. It's driven by signal and noise, but in this particular case, it's driven by the underlying construct and by more specific associations with the question. So, for example, many racism scales include specific situations. Would you mind having a black person as a boss? Would you mind having a black person marry into your family? Such items. The idea is all of them are predicted by an underlying construct of racism, but then also each of them is predicted by other things. You might have had a really bad experience with one particular black boss, so that question might also be driven by that. You might get unexpected noise in there. So the idea is if we ask several questions that are all meant to be related to the same construct, this random noise will average out and the signal will be more easily detectable. But clearly that only works. Combining multiple questions will only reduce measurement error if all the questions measure the same thing. We'll talk in a moment about how we can figure that out. There are two more reasons for combining multiple items. One is that generally we can't measure continuous attitudes. Usually we would measure attitudes on a scale from 1 to 7, maybe a scale from 1 to 10, so we have specific points that people can stand on. If we now average across multiple items, then we can actually get a continuous measure of racism, sexism, egalitarianism, whatever we might want to measure. That's one reason for using multiple items. And then the final reason is that if we use more than one item, we can have items that go in opposite directions. So for egalitarianism, we could have an item that says, do you agree that it's important that everyone is treated equally? Or we could have one item that says, do you agree that it is important that there are differences that motivate people to work hard? And then we would need to reverse code one of them. But if we have people that always have a tendency to say yes, then that would equal out across those two items. So having a scale allows us to ask items that go in different directions and thereby reduce any impact of an acquiescence bias. For example, in the European Social Survey, they're interested in social trust, and quite often social trust is just measured with this one item. This item exists in most social surveys. Do you think most people can be trusted, or do you think that you can't be too careful? However, someone might have a very particular reaction to the word trust, for example. So what the European Social Survey does is that they add two other items that are meant to be indicators of the same underlying construct. So they ask, well, do you think most people try to take advantage or are fair? Or do you think most people are helpful or look out for themselves? And then we now have a 3-item scale that's meant to tap into social trust. If we now calculate an average of these 3 items, we can already see that we get a much more continuous histogram, a much more continuous distribution than we would ever be able to get from one rating item. So that's already an achievement here. However, we still need to figure out if these items actually measure the same thing. And the way to do that, the way to test for internal consistency, is to basically look at the correlations between the items. So are they all correlated to each other? Obviously with many items there are lots of correlations, so we need a method to combine them all. And for that, so-called Cronbach's alpha is most frequently used. So that's based on the inter-item correlations and the number of items. And it gives us a single number that's again conveniently bounded between 0 and 1. And the higher it is, the more internally consistent that set of items is. They're in common thresholds, so we would say, well, if Cronbach's alpha for a set of items is higher than 0.7, or if it's very few items, then maybe 0.6. If it's higher than that, we can say this is an acceptable scale. If it's higher than 0.8, it's probably a good scale. If it's higher than 0.9, you might have to start thinking whether you're asking too many items. Because it might be a brilliant scale, but your participants might also just get very tired, and it might be too expensive. But so ideally we want to be somewhere in the 0.8 range. Because that now means our items really closely fit together and measure the same thing. And if that's the case, then we have a good justification for averaging our items and saying, now this average score is measuring an underlying construct. So in the social trust example, we have these 3 items. We could now use the alpha function from the psych package that we're going to explore in class to calculate Cronbach's alpha. The function gives lots of different details in its output, but the most important is that it gives us Cronbach's alpha and its confidence interval. So here we can say that we can be very confident that Cronbach's alpha is in the high 0.7 range, so that this is an acceptable to good scale for measuring social trust. The alpha function also automatically calculates the scores, and now these scores can be added to the dataset, can be used in future analysis. So once we have the questionnaire, we want to figure out what are the scales, are they consistent, can they be combined? The other thing to figure out is, do we need to weight any responses? Ideally, or maybe not ideally, but in the easiest case, our sample is exactly representative of the population, so we don't need to do anything about it. But quite often, in large surveys, the samples are not exactly representative by design. For example, because we might say we want to be able to do subgroup analysis by regions, maybe by ethnicities, but we want to be able to have precise statistical estimates for some smaller groups. What do? Well, we oversample these groups, we make sure that our sample contains enough people from a specific region, but that's then something we need to correct for later on. Something similar might happen in the data collection process. If we do a phone survey, usually many young people don't have a landline, don't pick up, don't have time. So in our sample we might actually have far too few young people. Both of these can be dealt with by giving more weight to participants in our sample that come from a group that's underrepresented and less weight to participants that come from a group that's overrepresented when we calculate any statistical parameters. The European Social Survey, for example, has 3 different weights in the dataset. One are design weights. The idea behind design weights is exactly to correct for these deviations that come about because certain groups were oversampled by design. Post-stratification weights are then weights that try to correct for differential response. So we might find out that we are missing women, that we are missing young people, we're missing some such group. Then we get these post-stratification weights that try to correct for that. And in international surveys, like this one, we tend to also get population weights. Because this is a survey that's run, I think, in about 40 countries. Clearly, some of these countries are tiny by comparison to others, but their sample sizes can't be proportional to the population sizes. Because in any country, we need a sample of a couple of thousand to get robust estimates. But then if we combine that internationally, clearly the respondents from Luxembourg need to have a lower weight than the respondents from the UK for us to say this is now our estimate across Europe, so that's a population weight. Those 3 are often provided in the survey data set and can be used, and in some cases really have to be used. Please have a look at the separate video on how to use them in R. We'll only employ some very basic weighting. That's a topic for a more advanced course, how to do that fully. But you need to have the conceptual understanding of why it matters. So what to remember from this video? The first thing is that there are many good, large survey data sets out there freely available to researchers. And it can often be a really good way to frame your own research, to justify certain assumptions. So it's worth keeping in mind that they exist. Surveys, if you want to create your own or evaluate someone else's, need to be designed very carefully with regard to how they sample their participants, with regard to what kind of questions they ask. So those are things you also should check when you look at an existing survey data set. Surveys usually use response scales, where the idea is that we have multiple items measuring the same construct. If that is the case, we need to check whether those scales are actually internally consistent, so whether all the items measure the same construct. And if they do, we need to calculate the scale values and then use them in statistical analysis. And finally, sampling decisions and response rates quite often lead to a situation where we need to weight the data, give different weights to different participants before we can do any statistical calculations that are actually good indicators for population values. So, that's just a very quick intro into social surveys. Please do take a little bit of time to think about how you might be able to measure a variable in your own research through a survey, thinking about some of these issues, about what people are actually able and willing to share with you. Then we'll look at some examples in class in practice how to analyze the social survey datasets in R. See you there.